Today, I'll be getting into, and I'll be talking about mostly the foreign policy issues, of course, that occurred under President, Woodrow Wilson, who I think last lecture had talked about that time period, where I think I talked about like the end of like Teddy Roosevelt's administration, and I went into Taft, and then of course Woodrow Wilson, mostly talking about the domestic reforms that he was kind of known for. And then, of course, today I'll be getting to like foreign policy stuff. Of course, the big things that happened under Wilson, two big things, of course, was the conflicts with Mexico, the so-called Mexican Revolution. It was going down there, the 1910s. And then, of course, you had, the World War I that broke out in Europe, of course, in 1914, which I'll, of course, be talking about, pretty much today. But, of course, I want to first talk about, before I really get into World War I do need to, like I said, first talk about the so-called Mexican Revolution, that broke out on our border to the south in Mexico, which occurred, by the way, from 1910 to 1920. Mexico went through their own revolution, which, would eventually lead to various reforms, mostly social reforms that would occur in the country. And of course, it led to a lot of deterioration of relations between us, United States, and Mexico. It's something that's, of course, that would happen. It did influence our entry into the war, because Germany came in and started supporting Mexico against us. So that kind of undermined that, and of course, led to eventually it occurring. Of course, the revolution would later lead to a lot of reforms in Mexico, which the primary thing, later was the Mexican Constitution of 1917, which created a lot of social, reforms to it and all that. But why did it break out? Well, besides a lack of reforms in Mexico, especially with the lower classes in dealing with like land reform and stuff like that, a lot of it had to do with the president and dictator of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz, who had been in power for something like 30-something years. And anyway, a lot of people, of course, think they needed reforms of the country. But Diaz had been, very close to the United States. He was pretty much one of these dictators that we had backed because he defended pretty much American property that was in Mexico and businesses in general, which I think was like to a tune of like something like $1 billion in, business that we had down there and all that. But what happened with the Mexican War, kind of get to it like right here, there's Diaz, as you can see. There was what started the whole revolution. There was an election in 1910, which is the so-called Mexican election of 1910 for the presidency. And there was this wealthy landowner that ran against him named Francisco Madero. You can see I'll blow up right here to look at it. So Madero ran against him. However, the elections, they think the results were rigged. They think Madero won, but Diaz rigged the election. After the election was over, he actually arrested Madero eventually. What happened was it caused the revolution to break out, which occurred on November 20th when people revolted against that. When he, had Madero arrested. And so today in Mexico, they still celebrate what they call Revolution Day. You may know about this November 20th, which is kind of like an anniversary and national holiday that they have. But Mexican Revolution will last like 10 years. It'll go on from like 1910 to 1920. And what will happen eventually is that the revolution will kind of spread. It'll kind of spread from the cities. It'll go to the countryside. It'll involve like the middle class. The peasants get involved a lot, the Indians in Mexico. And one of the things that happened in Mexico, of course, you see the rise of these dictators and generals that start to take over the country during that 10-year period, more or less. And some of these men you may have heard of, like Pancho Villa, probably the most famous, that was really involved in the revolution. He supported Madero from the beginning. Pancho Villa was a famous Mexican bandit and general that was in northern Mexico, mostly around the Chihuahua area, northeastern part of Mexico. Emiliano Zapata was also involved in the revolution too. He also backed Madero initially. He was in the South. I think he was part Indian or something like that. And he supported like the peasants and the Indians and all that. And then Victoriano Carranza and Herta were also these two other dictators that were kind of rivals. That were like generals that were kind of like under Diaz and Madero. What happened, Madero eventually was able to get Diaz. They forced him to resign, and Diaz went into exile. He left the country and never came back. But General Venustiano Herta, who was a general that was under Madero, overthrew him in a coup. He overthrew Madero and had him murdered. Yeah, I think he killed his vice presidents too, also as well. And so when Herta did that, it angered the United States. I think probably the previous administration of Taft would have supported him, but when Wilson came in 1913, he refused to support Victoriano Herta's government. He saw it as being unjust and undemocratic, immoral. And so one of the things that Wilson started doing, if you know about it, he started selling arms to Carranza, gave him support instead over Herta, and he even began to try to block Mexico's ports because of the fact that the Germans tried to support Herta over the other generals and dictators. So it's kind of a mess, in Mexico with that. Yeah, because the Germans were, just the World War I was going on. They started to support some of the Mexicans, of course, during the war. And it got so heated that in 1914, they had the so-called Tampico Affair, you may have heard of, or incident that's sometimes dubbed, where some American soldiers were actually captured by some of Herta's soldiers, and they were imprisoned. Anyway, the U.S. then what they did was we went in with our Marines, basically. We occupied Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico, which is on the eastern side of Mexico. Eventually conflict was averted, but war with Mexico almost broke out because of that. We were also trying to blockade the city ports like Veracruz because the Germans were coming in with their ships trying to supply the Mexicans and all that. So we're trying to keep arms from coming in from Germany. This is during World War I. That's going on in Europe. Finally, what happened was in 1915, by the way, Madero was murdered, if you know about this. But Herta goes eventually. He's going to eventually be ousted. So Madero's dead. Herta is going to eventually have to be forced into exile too, as well, because in 1915, Carranza then seizes power in Mexico, takes over, and he begins to embrace a lot of the revolutionary forms in the country. I think I've got a picture of, there's Herta right there, you can see, and then Carranza also as well, another Mexican general as well. By the way, a lot of them were assassinated, which I've kind of maybe mentioned about later if you want. But what happened was the Carranza came in, and Pancho Villa and Zapata were kind of angry. They felt they weren't getting part of the whole deal with Carranza. And so Pancho Villa and Zapata kind of formed an alliance with each other afterwards, maybe try to take over the country after that. And Pancho Villa, who I've got a picture of, I've got several pictures, I think, of Pancho Villa, who's right here. He, of course, would attack the United States in 1916. Not because he necessarily, wanted to go to war with, the United States, but Pancho Villa was hoping to undermine Carranza's government. Maybe hopefully get him out of power, then maybe he could take over. And I think he wanted to be president of Mexico, something like that. And so he did these raids into New Mexico. Anyway, in New Mexico, about 40 Americans were killed when they went in there. I think it's referred to as the Battle of Columbus, which occurred, by the way, on the date of March 9th, 1916. Well, yeah, 40 Americans were killed, wounded. Pancho Villa's forces suffered badly in the attack. They didn't do so well, took heavy casualties, but it angered the United States so much that the United States tried to go into Mexico and intervene and to go after, of course, Pancho Villa, who, by the way, is still a big hero of Mexico, if you know about that. Here's the other guy, Zapata, also as well. You can see he was later assassinated as well. So the United States would go after him. They'd try to hunt him down, so General John Pershing went in there with thousands of troops to try to go after Pancho Villa. It's called all kinds of names: the Pancho Via Expedition, the Mexican Punitive Expedition, I think was another name as well. Something like over 10,000 troops went into northern Mexico after him. It lasted about almost a year. That they were trying to hunt down Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa didn't have that many forces. I think he had, I want to say 500 troops under him or something like that. Not that many, mostly a bunch of bandits. But they still couldn't capture him. They failed to capture him. And his real name, by the way, is Doroteo Arango, if you want to know. Pancho Villa was just like a nickname. But even though that, they never captured Pancho Villa, it did kind of lead to, like I said, tensions between Mexico and the United States. And of course, later on, it's going to, end up leading, the United States into war, because Germany's going to come in, like I said, and try to get the Mexicans to try to support them in the war to fight us. And that's what, caused the whole thing, of course, to occur. Yeah, a lot of those guys all died, by the way. Like, just you read about all the different, like the ones I just talked about: Carranza, Madero, Pancho Villa, Zapata. At one point during the whole revolution, they all got killed either during it or after. So a lot of the big revolutionaries that were in, or dictators, were killed at one point. It was also a very bloody conflict. 1.5 million people died during the Mexican Revolution. It was more like a civil war. And a bunch of people even fled the country. Some even came to the United States, try to flee it and all that. All right, I want to get in next. And of course, I want to, talk about, World War I. We'll come back and we'll talk about John Pershing later. Of course, he went after Pancho Villa. He's also involved, of course, in, World War I. So World War I, you can see there, lasted from 1914 to 1918. So yeah, you can see, 4 years, almost 4.5 to be exact, how many years it was. Of course, one of the first things I'm going to get into, we're going to talk about today, is the fact that, the U.S. eventually gets in to the war, which won't be till 1917. But there's a lot of different causes of why the war broke out. Of course, let's first talk about, what they called the war. It's called all kinds of names. World War I, the First World War. Of course, the veterans that fought in the war, of course, didn't call it that. They called it the Great War. And that's just because of the fact that World War II hadn't happened yet. So nobody starts really calling it World War I until they have World War II. Hopefully there's not a World War III. God forbid. So the veterans all call it the Great War. They thought it was the war, to end all wars, that there wouldn't be any more wars ever. But that, of course, just proved to be not right, because you end up having worse wars later, like World War II. I think 9 million soldiers died in World War I. Then I think in World War II, the casualties were something like 5 times that, which will be later. So under Wilson, at first when the war broke out in Europe in 1914, we stayed neutral for about 3 years or so, 1914 to 1917. However, I'll get to it later. The United States begins to support the Allied sides against the Germans in the war. Now it's just because of the fact that the Germans were in such, aggression against us in the Atlantic, Mexico. And so that had a lot to do with why the United States later, would eventually support the Allied side. Now, let me go ahead and get into today, and we'll talk about, what the causes of the war were pretty much, which World War One had a lot of different causes that were part of the war. So, what were some of the causes, of World War One that were there? Well, you can see, obviously, some of those things there you can see are the so-called isms I'll get to later that they talk about sometimes, like nationalism, imperialism, militarism. Those are definitely some reasons why, of course, it worked, what happened. Entangling alliances. You have these two opposing alliances that eventually fight each other. That was another reason why it occurred, especially because France and Germany didn't like each other too much, at the end of the 18th century, in the 1800s and all that. But the big thing that they always talk about that really caused it initially was all the different rivalries of the different powers in Europe, the so-called great powers. You can see Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Italy, Austria, Hungary, even the Ottoman Empire. They're all kind of competing against each other in Europe, for control of Europe, for control of trade routes, imperialism throughout the world. And so this intense rivalry between these different powers is pretty much what was part of the reason why the war broke out. It wasn't just that, it was Germany. Germany, of course, had a lot to do with why eventually World War I broke out. It was because of the rise of Germany in the late 19th century. And they believe German unification, 1871, was definitely a major role in reason why that would occur. About Germany, it unified due to the Kingdom of Prussia, which basically was the brainchild of, you can see, the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, who was known as the Iron Chancellor. He's one who kind of got all the German states to combine as one empire. And then from there, what happened was the Germans, because they had kind of unified as one large state, Central Europe, they became a big rival to Britain and France, not just in Europe, but throughout the world. They become this industrial rival power, and they try to rival them with their military, with their armies, with their navy. They even start building colonies like in Africa, in the Pacific as well. So that's pretty much, one of the main things, that would be involved. Germany didn't really start World War I, but they were definitely seen as the aggressors in the war. And so that's why they get blamed for it, later on after the war. The war had a lot of long-term causes. So, new imperialism, which might have been one of the oldest ones that went back to the 1800s, that was one, where, like I said, the different European powers were starting to colonize parts of Africa, like the so-called scramble for Africa that started like around the 1870s, as an example, that went up to World War I. They also went in like China and Asia, the European powers, the Pacific, started colonize those areas of the Pacific. Nationalism. You have this case in Europe in the 1800s where nationalism becomes a popular movement, ideologically, where countries want to nationalize the Poles, the Slavs, and so on. Want to have nationalism. Arabs, even Jews, want like their own state, and things like that. So that had a lot to do with it. Also rivalries where one state thought they were better than the other, like the French thought they were better than the Germans. That kind of helps to also do it. A lot of people also thought war was patriotic. Going off the war, people still do. People still think fighting for your country is a patriotic thing as well. Militarism, or arms race, that's another cause of World War I. The fact that before the war, both sides started stockpiling arms, which were all more advanced because of the Industrial Revolution. So both sides, like the Germans and the British, wanted to have these new dreadnoughts, which were these kind of battleships they started building, prior to the war. But you had all kinds of new weapons like machine guns, new kinds of artillery, airplanes, tanks, submarines, everybody starts building the same thing and stockpiling it. That leads to the war. And then, of course, you got the rival alliance systems. That's the thing that really they think really helps to cause World War I. You got these two rival alliances that you got here, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. World War I was really a chain reaction war, where both those two alliances fought each other, and it caused a big war. And you can see the different alliances. The Triple Alliance had Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in it. The Triple Entente had Britain, France, and Russia in it. Both those, by the way, were formed mostly by Germany and France, who hated each other. They kind of saw them as big rivals in Europe. But later when the war broke out, you see later, of course, what happens when World War I broke out in 1914, you had Italy would stay neutral. They would end up joining the Triple Entente later, like on the French side in the war. And the Ottoman Empire would join the other side with the Triple Alliance. They would replace Italy as an ally. And so you got these two later. When you have World War I later, they don't call them those names. They eventually call them these other names you've probably heard of, which is the Allied side in the war. Those are the main powers that fight later in World War I. France, Britain, Russia, Italy, USA, Serbia, and Romania. Those are mostly the powers that were together in the war. And on the Central Powers, you had Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, and of course you see Bulgaria as important, but they were also on the Central Powers side also in the war. So basically, I'll get to it later, but Austria-Hungary is going to attack Serbia, which is on the other alliance, and so that's what helps cause World War I to break out, because Russia don't like it. Russia, of course, is kind of like an ally of Serbia, and you can see that's what one thing that eventually leads to it. Here, by the way, is a map showing you what Europe kind of looks like before the war. So yeah, you can see how basically the different sides that were in the war at the time. So all those areas in green, like the more lighter green, is the so-called Triple Entente, and then the more darker greenish color there is like your Triple Alliance that's in the middle. You can understand why they call it Central Powers, because they're kind of like in the central part of Europe, basically. You've also got the Slavic allies of Russia, like Serbia's allied with the Russians. So you can see that's kind of what helps to cause, World War I eventually when it does break out. Now, I did want to talk about one of the things that really helped to cause World War I to break out. And I'm sure you probably heard about this story about what actually caused it to break out. It was over this man named the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. If you know about it, he was shot in 1914. And of course, that helped to cause, World War I to break out. So yeah, the so-called assassination of Franz Ferdinand was really considered to be one of the main causes of why World War I broke out in 1914. He was actually the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. His actual uncle, who was Emperor Franz Joseph I, was the actual ruler of Austria-Hungary. I think his son had killed himself or something like that, and so he was going to give the throne to his nephew, who was the Archduke of Austria. Anyway, the assassination took place on June 28th, 1914, a place called Sarajevo, Bosnia, which used to be part of what they call Yugoslavia a long time ago during the Cold War. And it happened in the so-called Balkans region, which if you go back to that map I was showing you, which I can kind of, where it was right there, that map right here. The Balkans area was an area of Europe that was basically, it was kind of like in this area here. Like up in this area, this is the Balkans area, which is, in fact, the Balkans really goes down from all the way here, all the way to like Greece. So-called Balkans Peninsula. And anyway, in Europe, there was a belief that that area would have a big war break out one day, which I think people joke that it was like a powder keg of Europe right there. Because you had all these Slavs living there that wanted basically their own state, like a Slavic type state, like a Yugoslavia, which would happen after World War I. And so they think that's part of what led to the Archduke getting shot, because some of these pan-Slavic groups thought that if they killed the Archduke, that might lead to their own state being formed and all that. So that's definitely a major cause of why, World War I, eventually broke out in Europe. Well, if you study about the war, the conflict with this assassination that led to the war, it was actually a organization that was behind it, that planned it, that sent the assassins, of course, into what is Bosnia to kill the Archduke. And that was this kind of like a terrorist secret organization that was called the Black Hand. It was actually a Serbian military secret society, but they used like assassinations and bombings to gain like power in the Balkans region. And they're called Black Hand because they put up posters and have a black hand on it. But their real name was not Black Hand. It was just a nickname for the actual organization. They were called Union or Death because the belief was that they either had to die or have a unified Yugoslavia. That was their main goal, pretty much. That man right there you're looking at to the that picture right there, that's Dragutin Dmitrievich, who was called, by the way, Apis, which I think meant the bull. And he was a captain in the Serbian army. He was in military intelligence. And he was believed to be the man that they think planned the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So he planned it. And they eventually ended up sending something like 7, mostly boys, to try to kill the Archduke. So, and now I'll show you the assassin who's kind of well known now today. His name is Gavrilo Princip. He would be, of course, the assassin that would eventually kill the Archduke. He was only 19. He was actually Bosnian. He was a Bosnian student. He was actually in this kind of a pro-Slavic group called the Young Bosnia, and he had been recruited with the Black Hand to participate in the assassination attempt on the Archduke. And so he began training, I think, sometime in 1914. There's a story where he would go to the forest near Belgrade, and he'd do target practice and stuff like that. He was a horrible shot. He would shoot at a tree and miss or something like that. He was a bad shot, apparently. Well, apparently what happened, if you know about it, the Archduke and his wife eventually came to Sarajevo. Why did they go to Sarajevo? The Archduke and his wife. Well, the Archduke was doing like a kind of a state visit to Bosnia, which Bosnia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. It had been annexed in the early 1900s. And what was going on was that the Austro-Hungarian army was doing troop exercises near the Serbian border. So he was there kind of to watch that. And then he was going to do a tour of basically Sarajevo in an open car. And I think it happened to be, by the way, their wedding anniversary, the day they got shot. It's true about that. So there they are, of course, touring the city. I do got a picture of the actual car that they got shot in. There's the death car, I think they sometimes called it, which I think it was a bullet hole in the door, which you can't quite see, but I think it's like, it's hard to see it right here, but there's a bullet hole right here where Princip shot his first shot. You can't see it very well, but it's right there. I do have a picture of the pistol too, which is I believe it was a Browning automatic. It's an American-style pistol that he used to shoot the Archduke. The assassins, by the way, were armed with they had cyanide. Sounds like a James Bond thing, but they were supposed to kill the Archduke and then take poison so they wouldn't be captured. It's kind of crazy. Anyway, what happened was there were actually 2 attempts on his life. The Archduke. Yeah, there was actually a deal where not him, but another fellow assassin threw a bomb at the motorcade as it went through the city, and it hit the back of the car and blew up, but it didn't do anything. I think it wounded some people in the street, but he basically wasn't killed in the first attempt. And when the Archduke went to go visit with the mayor of Sarajevo, he was furious with them. He said something like, I come here for a visit and they throw bombs at me. He was expecting people to throw flowers at him, I guess, instead. And then what caused the assassination was the Archduke then his wife got in the car again. They were going to go to the hospital to visit those that had been wounded in the attempt instead of leaving, I guess, town like they should have. And so what happened was, as they were going to the hospital, Princeps got lucky, and apparently the driver didn't know where he was going. He went down a dead-end street. He was backing up. Princeps just walked up to him and shot him, basically. So Princeps actually killed both of them. He killed the Archduke and his wife. Although, if you go back to that picture I just showed you with the car, he actually fired first, and he hit the Archduke's wife, Sophie. Yeah, shot her first, or the Archduchess, which was an accident. He wasn't trying to shoot her. Shot her first, I think in the stomach somewhere. She would die. And in the second shot, he shot the Archduke in the neck, and he died. So basically, yeah, he kills both of them right there on June 28th, 1914. He was captured too, by the way. I think they show a picture here of him being kind of beat up afterwards. I don't know if you see it right here in the picture, but afterwards, I think some of the soldiers that captured him took their swords and they started beating him with it on the broadside of it. I think he tried to shoot himself and take the cyanide, but the gun jammed and then the cyanide just made him sick. It didn't kill him. So he would end up getting captured. He would die in prison, by the way, of tuberculosis, I think in 1918, before the war actually ended. So Princeps basically kills two people, but it ends up, they say, causing 9 million deaths because of World War I that would later break out later. So all just one man that does that and cause the whole war to explode. All right, now let me get into next. So there's the so-called, assassination that of course occurs. What's going to occur next, of course, is that basically Germany's going to end up, in the war here. But before that happens, of course, one of the things that's going to occur is that Austria and Serbia are going to get into it first, is what will happen. And one of the things that happened first was that Austria-Hungary first sent an ultimatum to the Serbians because they blamed them for it, even though the Black Hand was really behind it. I think the Serbian government wasn't really directly involved. It was these people in the military that were really in it. But they gave them an ultimatum to have all the people arrested, including Dragotin Dimitrovic, who was later killed, I think, by the Serbians because of what he did. And what eventually happens is that Austria-Hungary, which is backed by Germany, who pretty much give them a blank check, decides to declare war on Serbia, which they do on July the 28th, 1914. So that's what begins World War I, with Austria-Hungary, coming into the war versus Serbia. But what's going to happen later is the fact that the other powers like, Russia and France aren't going to like this. It leads to, mobilization on both sides. So you end up getting, Germany, ends up, declaring war throughout Europe at that time. And you get all these powers that come in that start fighting each other against each other. So Germany will end up declaring war on Russia and France. And then even Britain gets involved. Britain decides to basically get involved in the war also as well. Why did Britain get in the war too? Britain, I'll get to it in a second, but they are worried about their empire and all that coming in. Germany enters the war on August the 1st, where they declare war on Russia. And then on August the 3rd, 2 days later, they declare war on France as well. Why do they do that? They realized that they declared war on Russia, that France would declare war on them too. because the French and the Russians were together in the same alliance, Triple Entente. And so then they also realized that they're going to have to fight a two-front war, because Russia's in the east, France is in the west, so they know this. So that's the reason for it. Britain, I told you, feared that the Germans were going to take over their empire, so they felt like they were obligated to get in the war. And Britain and France were kind of closely allied since, they're kind of like since early 1900s. They had become real close with the French, and then I think they say that Belgium had something to do with it too. The fact that the Germans invaded through Belgium, which is a neutral power that was kind of an ally of the British, and so that played kind of a role too of why that all happened. So Austria-Hungary is backed by the Germans. The Germans are led by Kaiser Wilhelm I, and they pretty much gave them a blank check to fight the war. The Germans end up blowing up the war and expanding it, and so that's why Germany is considered to be like the whole aggressor in the war, because they expanded it. Started fighting Russia and France and making it a wider war at that point. All right, so that's how the war starts. So you can kind of see a map showing you the actual, different alliances that are there and powers that are, fighting in the war. You can see, so you can see all the powers that are, central powers, like I said, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and then of course Ottoman Empire will enter by the end of the year in 1914 as well. Britain, France, Italy will join the war in 1915, Allied side. Russia, Romania, Serbia, I guess Greece and Albania are kind of on the same side also as well, that you can see right there. So those are all the powers. Spain, of course, is neutral in the war. They didn't do much in World War I and World War II also as well. So yeah, that's kind of what things are looking like. And of course, later we will get involved in that war on the side of the French, of course. But let me go ahead and talk about, of course, a few things today about what the Germans did in the war. The Germans would eventually invade France because I told you the fact that the Germans were concerned about this two-front war that they're having to fight against the French and the Russians. And so back in 1905, they had developed this military plan called the Schlieffen Plan. You can see there, which was developed by Alfred Schlieffen, who was a famous German general in the early 1900s. The idea was that they wanted to fight the French first. They were the bigger power. They had a bigger, industrial base, especially in the northern part of France. And Russia was the weaker power. They thought it would take the Russians a lot longer to mobilize from, east to west to attack the Germans. And so the French wanted to, the Germans wanted to put something like their 80% of their troops on the Western Front to take out France first, and then take out the Russians. So you can see there what they wanted to do: mobilize their forces, push through Belgium and Luxembourg into northern France, sweep around Paris, and take Paris. This is, by the way, what the Germans did in the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71, where they laid siege to Paris, and of course France lost the war. So it's kind of trying to repeat what happened with the Franco-Prussian War. And by the way, this mobilization of the German forces to attack France was supposed to take only 6 weeks. Yeah, 6 weeks, 1.5 months, basically, to take France. Of course, they would fail. Hitler would succeed, by the way, World War II, about 1940, but they had better mobilization of force with tanks and trucks and things like that, where they could move their forces around. They didn't have that. They had to move everything by horses and stuff like that at the time. So yeah, that was pretty much it with that. So they were kind of concerned about, trying to mobilize their forces, to the west. But what ends up happening is in 1914, by September of 1914, the German forces, push, like I said, into northern France. Kind of a map showing you a little bit of it where they go into. northern France and Belgium, and it leads to the so-called Battle of the Marne, which takes place somewhere around the second week of September. Also called the First Battle of the Marne. It's called different names, by the way. First Battle of the Marne was one of the largest battles in European history so far. It involved something like 2 million troops combined, like on both sides, mostly French and British versus the Germans. By the way, the last major battle that was even close to that was the Battle of the Nations in Leipzig, Germany in 1813, which had 500,000 troops when the European coalition powers defeated Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars. So that's kind of comparing that with that. And I think in the battle, they had something like 150,000 people killed and wounded. It was that bloody of a battle, like in the first battle of the whole war right there. And what happened was the Germans tried to push on Paris, but they failed. They failed to take the city. They came up short by 20, 30 miles or more. And what happened was the French, along with some of the British, with the so-called British Expeditionary Force that came over from Britain, they were able to push back the German onslaught on Paris. It became known as the Miracle on the Marne. And so that ends up stalemating basically what would be the so-called Western Front, as they call it, which is fought in northern France and Belgium. So you got the first real front that really forms in World War I. And the Western Front, by the way, was the bloodiest front in World War I. More men were killed on the Western Front than any front I forget how many it was, must have been 80% or more were killed on the Western Front. And later on, we'll get to it later, but I don't know if I'll get in this class, but this lecture here, but basically you get battles in 1916, like Verdun and Somme, where you got something like 1 to 2 million men killed in the war. So the United States really missed out on some of the most bloodiest, conflicts of the war. Battles we fought in weren't as bad compared to those wars that were fought prior to when we entered the war in 1917. Why was World War I so bloody? Well, one was the trench warfare that they had, that they fought in. It was a very defensive war, most of the war, at least up until 1918, that made it very difficult. So really you had to go over the top and take the other trenches. And when you tried to, you'd get just mowed down by machine guns or rifle fire. So very, very difficult. And then you had all the different new technologies they had in the war, like new kinds of weapons of war that they had in World War I. I do have a little short video I'll show you, of course, to kind of give you an idea of what kind of weapons they had in the war.
While they may seem primitive now, the weapons of World War I completely revolutionized warfare. Hi, I'm Rebecca Brayton and welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be exploring the weapons and technology used in the First World War. Mainly, soldiers used bolt-action rifles. These were capable of firing approximately 10 rounds per minute. Machine guns were used by large powers, however, were only useful in stationary battles as they were larger and less mobile. Heavy siege guns, such as Germany's Big Bertha, also were important in the battles of World War I. One of the biggest innovations during World War I was the use of poison gas. In fact, the widespread use of different poisons even had many calling the First World War the Chemists' War. The French were the first to use gas during the war. In August 1914, they used grenades filled with tear gas to combat the Germans. In 1915, the Germans began to use chlorine, the first gas considered lethal. Mustard gas became a significant source of dread for soldiers, as simple exposure to it could burn flesh and cause massive blisters. However, as the use of various gases increased, soldiers became more prepared to confront them. It has been estimated that only about 4% of the deaths in the war can be attributed to gas. The first use of the tank took place during World War I as well. The British and the French led the way in developing tanks, while the Germans focused on anti-tank weapons. Initially, tanks had been brought in as a solution to the stalemate caused by trench warfare on the Western Front. The first appearance on the battlefield was in 1916. 1916. The British rushed them into combat, and consequently many were plagued with reliability issues. The heavily bombed-out terrain proved difficult to navigate, and only the most mobile tanks were successful. Nevertheless, the appearance of tanks increased throughout the war as the issues with earlier models were addressed. In the end, British and French tanks played a significant role in the Allied victory.
So a short little video there, of course, showing the different new kinds of technologies that they had, of course, in World War One. Yeah, the tank was something they developed. I think the first Battle of the Somme, I think, was the first battle where the British used it. So you can see all kinds of different new kinds of weapons. The machine gun, some of those machine guns can fire up to several hundred bullets a minute, which is pretty amazing. Yeah, chemical weapons like mustard gas was one of the most famous. Of course, they used chlorine also as well. Of course, the U-boat, so-called submarines, were, of course, started to be used by both sides. The Germans did use what they call zeppelins, where they dropped bombs over Britain, something they did during World War One. They didn't mention the flamethrower, but the flamethrower was invented also, of course, in World War One as well. Of course, the airplane is also used. You may have heard of the Red Baron. Red Baron was considered one of the greatest aviation aces in World War One, who had I think something like 80 kills or something like that, crazy amount. So just kind of different kinds of weapons, of course, that were used in World War One. A lot of these weapons are kind of used later in World War Two. That are kind of evolved from then, and so a lot of the weapons they have then are used later, more or less. All right, so I'm going to, of course, move on. Of course, I've got a few minutes here. I can go ahead and talk about how the United States, of course, also gets in the war. So you're going to see here, by the way, here's kind of a map, by the way, of Europe, like during the war. You can see all the different fronts they had. So Western Front, was the main front they had in the war, where I think majority of the soldiers were killed and wounded in the war. You can see it went from like the North Sea and what is the English Channel right here, all the way down to Switzerland. And that's where they had it. There was an Italian front where Italy fought against mostly Austria-Hungary right here. There's the Balkans front here, where Austria-Hungary fought, of course, Serbia. And, of course, you got the Eastern Front. Eastern Front was the second bloodiest front in the war, where Germany, Austria-Hungary, and also what is, I believe, Bulgaria fought against Russia, and I think Romania as well. And, yeah, that was pretty bloody. And at one point, the actual Germans, Central Powers, pushed back the Russians back into what is the Ukraine. And, of course, if you know about that, it caused the Russian Revolution to break out in 1917, and eventually had Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks seized power, which later led to the foundation of the Soviet Union. So Russian Revolution is one of those things that kind of was caused by World War One. The fact the Russians were losing the war, and also the fact that you had all these different social problems they had, of course, in Russia as well. But anyway, I'm going to get into next. I want to talk, of course, about how, the United States, of course, would enter, next into World War One. So yeah, you got the United States is going to get drawn into, the war because of German aggression in the Atlantic Ocean. A lot of it had to do with Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare that they had going on, and want to kind of talk about that. What kind of gets us involved in the war? A lot of it had to do with the Germany's use of submarines that we're talking about, which are called U-boats or undersea boats, that they also call them as well. And so they began doing this between 1914 and 1917. The submarines have been around since like the 1800s, but the Germans were really the first ones to really use it a lot in warfare. And they began to sink a lot of Allied shipping, especially in the Atlantic Ocean. And so this really affected the war. That could almost cause the Germans to win World War I and World War II if they had been more effective. And it also affected the United States because, they began to sink shipping because we began to ship, arms and so on, supplies to the Allies. We began secretly supplying them overall. And also had a case where Americans would get killed on some of these ships. That, of course, when they got sunk. And one of the most famous incidents that happened, of course, if you know about it during World War I, was in 1915 with the famous sinking of the Lusitania that occurred. It's definitely considered to be one of the major things that helps us get in the war, as you know, is a major cause of it. And it's a major cause of why the United States supports the Allies over Germany. And what was Lusitania? Lusitania was a famous British passenger cruise liner, or ocean liner, if you want to call it, as well. It was owned by the Cunard Line. It's usually called the RMS Lusitania, as it's dubbed. And anyway, it was a ship that was bound from New York City to Liverpool. And I think it left, I want to say on May 1st, but he was going to sail across the Atlantic. Of course, nobody thought it would get sunk. And in the newspapers, the Germans put warnings to telling Americans don't get on the ship because they're sailing into a war zone pretty much. What happened was it was a U-boat named U-20, I believe it is. It sunk it in the Irish Sea on May 7th, 1915. Close to 60-some%, almost 2/3 of the crew and the passengers were killed when it went down. And 128 Americans were on board. They were going to Britain. They got killed. And almost 1,200, you can see 1,198 were actually killed when the ship went down. How come so many people died? Well, apparently when the ship got hit by a torpedo, which was, I think they say, only one, the ship quickly flipped on its side and sank in like 18 minutes. And so very few people could get out. And so basically, that's why he had so many people killed. So it's considered one of the worst ship disasters since the Titanic went down in 1912. So this made America mad. America was furious about this. It almost caused us to declare war on the Germans. In fact, the Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, which was William Jennings Bryan, wanted to declare war on them and threatened to resign as Secretary of State. And so it created a lot of anti-German sentiments in the country. People were kind of openly hostile to anything German, like if you play German music or something like that, or something German. People got mad about it. I'm, of course, partially German heritage. On my father's side, I'm related to Germans that came over here and fought for the Americans in the war. World War I or World War II. Like none of them did. I think they were kind of pretty much Americans by then, but I know, like, I want to say my great grandfather was still alive when the war broke out, and he had immigrated to America in the 1800s. I think close to, I want to say 1880s, I think, when he came over. But anyway, but yeah, none of them. I think one of my relatives, I think, had to register for the draft, but he never fought for America against the Germans. Probably didn't want to fight his own people, I guess, and all that. But anyway, so one of the things that happened because Lusitania got sunk, the American government passed an act, of course, the National Defense Act of 1916, which increased military defense spending, and because they realized we might have an open war with the Germans coming soon, and so they increased the amount of troops in the Army. U.S. Army had, I think, up to like 175,000. You can see there, and then for the U.S. Navy, they began building more naval ships during the war because they thought they might need those also in the war as well. So that definitely is something that really helped cause the war. What did the Germans do? Well, the Germans responded, if you know about this, by suspending their unrestricted submarine warfare policies, which they did for about, I guess, 1915 to 1917. It was called the Sussex Pledge or the Sussex Agreement, which was named for a ship, I think, that was sunk that was called the Sussex. I think there were some Americans on there that got killed too, I thought. And what happened was they said that what they would do was that they would warn ships that were non-combatant to basically, get off before they sank it, which is kind of ridiculous because what if the ship is armed and fires back? So that kind of thing. But the Germans eventually, what they did was they went back on their policy. Like at the beginning of, I think, January 1st, 1917, the Germans went back on their unrestricted submarine warfare policy. And so that's the thing that really got us in the war later. Well, they had one more thing that was also a cause of why we got in the war too. Here's, of course, by the way, a news clipping. You can see the sinking that was there. One of the Vanderbilts was on board, by the way, that went down. They never found the captain either. He died too. But the Zimmermann telegram, this, of course, was a major issue of why the United States got involved in the war. The Zimmermann telegram was a famous telegram that was sent in January of 1917. It was going to be sent to one of the foreign secretaries or ambassadors that was part of Mexico for the Germans. It was sent by this man named Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann in Germany, who sent it, I think, on January the 17th, 1917. However, it was intercepted by the British. And what happened was in March 1917, the British published it in the newspapers. I do have a picture, by the way, of it showing you what was in it right here. There's the actual Zimmermann telegram or Zimmermann note that was sent, of course, trying to send it. Well, they did send it, I guess. And it talks about the idea that they may end up in war with the United States. And so they proposed this idea to form an alliance with Mexico and to aid Mexico in fighting us. And also they promised, you can see there, to give Mexico back territory that they lost to the United States, mostly the Mexican-American War back in the 1800s, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So they're going to try to help them get that territory back, basically. Oh, and then you can see they even wanted to have an alliance with Japan. So they're hoping to get Mexico, Japan to join the Central Powers against the United States. And so you can understand why people were mad about this telegram. So they're kind of interfering in Mexico and all that. So yeah, that's something they wanted. They want to try to get that back, give that territory. So they have military aid, but not just that, but try to get lost territory back to them as well. And anyway, what ends up happening, that becomes the last straw, pretty much. And so by April of 1917, Wilson and U.S. Congress decide to basically declare war on the Germans, which they do on April the 6th, 1917. So, yeah, we get involved in the war. Of course, Woodrow Wilson, he basically had kind of reneged on his promise, if you remember correctly, to remember, he was going to basically keep us out of war, right? That was his plan, basically, when he ran in 1916 for re-election. But you can see there, he was saying that the world must be made safe for democracy. He realized that if we didn't fight the Germans, that who knows what would happen in the war and with Europe and all that. So I guess he saw it as being the right thing to do, to enter the war and support the Allies against the Germans. Also, the fact that Russia dropped out of the war because of the Russian Revolution. And so there was concern that if we didn't support them more, that the Germans would beat the French and the British on the Western Front, and that might alter things in Europe the way we didn't want. So I'm going to, of course, be talking more later about getting into, about World War I. Next week, I'll get into the bulk of the war, how the United States, gets involved in it. So we'll talk about that. And I'll probably, of course, we'll be getting into the post-World War I era. I'll get into like the 1920s after the war. So obviously we're moving along, towards, into the 20th century here right now with American history. And anyway, before I go, I want to remind you, don't forget about that assignment, the first exam. That's something y'all need to be, of course, be working on right now. Get that done for next week. Or that's on like 4 lectures I gave you to do and look at and take that, really a mini quiz, big quiz, I guess is kind of what it is, really. And that's about it for today. But like I said, if anybody has any questions about this lecture, let me know. So I guess we'll have it today, look like live. But if you have any questions, comments later, you can just leave them, of course, on my channel. So y'all have a good weekend coming up, and y'all take care. So I'll see y'all next Tuesday. So bye. Have a good weekend.